Hi. For 5 years, I was a high school English teacher in Tucson, Arizona, before I decided to pack up, move east, and go back to school in the hopes that one day I could learn enough about teaching to become a teacher of teachers. I'm not quite there yet. These days, I'm swimming in a vast pool of dense theory and theoretical density. I don't laugh enough, and I don't take enough time to let my mind frolic. I guess this is what's called being a professional student. When I was asked to prepare a TED Talk, I knew immediately that I wanted to talk about the people who have most inspired me during this lifetime, my former students. Separately and together, we've experienced great joy and great tragedy. Thus, one of the things that I've really cherished about preparing for this talk is having the opportunity to go back and unhurriedly reflect over my years of teaching, which, while not all that long ago, feel several lifetimes removed from my current circumstances. One of the difficult things for me in my reflecting has been to think about my teaching in terms of this event's three key words: imagine, create, innovate. I should clarify, though. My difficulty has not been in trying to scrape together some memories in which I observe my students imagining, creating, or innovating. Not at all. The difficulty here was in choosing from the thousands of brilliant things my students said and did every day and trying to distill that into a talk. So finally, after wading through a few hundred mental lockers full of memories, I decided to focus on what I consider to be the most imaginative, creative, innovative, collective practice that my students have in their arsenals: their use of humor to read and deconstruct the world around them, and their use of humor to write a better world. Humor that inquires, humor that inspires, humor that says no, asks why, pushes boundaries, and demands satisfaction. The sort of humor that can get a kid branded insubordinate or a troublemaker, removed from class, criminalized, deprived of instructional time, rather than rewarded for critical thinking, creativity, and a gentle refusal to say no, accept truths, or status quos as givens. I'm talking about humor here, but I'm not just talking about armpit farts or a zipper that remains in down position throughout the day. I mean, I do laugh at those things too, I have to admit it. But I want to talk here about a humor that questions the world and imagines it being a fundamentally different place, a better place, a more humane place. The sort of humor that is inherently political and that a lot of powerful people feel is pretty dangerous when employed by young people, because it calls into question the way that things could change. Not everybody necessarily wants things to change. It's why more than a few humorists have ended up in jail, or with their heads on pikes, or sitting in detention on a really nice sunny day like today. Forgive me for a tautology here, but students are without parallel when it comes to being students. They have unmatched insight into most aspects of the schooling practice. They are really the professional students here. In fact, nobody knows more about what it's like to sit in school day after day than students, and yet it's rare that they get to decide in most cases how their learning might be evaluated. Few students are asked, for instance, if they think spelling tests are a good way to become a better writer, or if they think SAT-level vocabulary words are a better way to build one's vocabulary. But this talk is not the time or place for me to take on high-stakes testing in general. I'd like to briefly talk about one specific test that every English and math teacher in my district used to administer 4 times a year. It was called the DAPS, or District Assessment Packages, and was what we in the teaching profession call a predictive test, in that it was supposed to accurately predict how well students would perform on a presumably more important test. In Arizona, the biggest test is called the AIMS, or Arizona's Instrument to Measure Standards, and all students had to pass its 3 sections in order to graduate from high school. The DAPS was designed to predict how well students would do on the AIMS, but here's the funny thing. Every one of my 11th grade students had already passed the AIMS, and they were still being asked to take the DAPS 4 times a year to predict how well they would do on it. It's a lot like wearing diapers for years and years and years after you're potty trained. I mean, I don't know how much sense it really makes. So my students were a lot of things, like endless list of things, but one thing that none of them could be called was stupid. What they pretty quickly realized was how terribly asinine this test was, how much of a waste of their collective time. And while they could have complained or whined or, tried to do really well on the test, a lot of them had other ideas. They got mad, and when they got mad, they got funny. They used the test's bubbles to create the most elaborate connect-the-dot messages and diagrams. In the margins, they doodled around. They made toothless pirate grins and old ladies bending over in their girdles. They wrote tiny editorials to the test administrators reflecting their dissatisfaction with the test and tried to force a dialogue. Taken as a whole, many of my students used humor in context as a deliberate act of critical thinking and social literacy, which, funny enough, were exactly the qualities the test was not evaluating for. When the students handed me their tests, I only had a short time to look down and gasp and guffaw before sealing them in an envelope and sending them off to the DAPS testing offices and waiting for the inevitable fallout to hit my inbox. It was a lot of biting, fortunately without any teeth, based around the same directive. I needed to make my students take the DAPS more seriously. Well, how do I do that? I'd inquire. Make the test affect their grades. No, I can't do that. The test isn't part of my curriculum. I don't even know what's on the test. Well, threaten them with disciplinary action. No, I can't do that either. They're not breaking any of my classroom rules. Well, they can't just draw pictures in the margins. The thing is, they could just draw pictures in the margins. Hilarious pictures in the margins. There was no way of forcing anybody to do anything otherwise. My students understood that the DAPS had no bearing, no context, no relevance in any way, especially not in their lives of learners with power and agency to imagine, to create, and to innovate. My students effectively said to powerful people, "You want to waste my time? Okay, then I'll waste yours, and I'll do it with a smile on my face." There's an old Ethiopian proverb that I love that says, "When the great Lord passes, the wise peasant bows deeply and then silently farts." I interpret this in the most optimistic way and take it to mean that sometimes tiny acts of silent resistance can have a large cumulative effect over time. Mirth is mighty. Small bits of humor, writ large, may cause asinine institutions to tumble. Nowhere is this more true and more necessary than in our schools, brimming as they are with tens of millions of young, critical, cosmopolitan intellectuals, laughers who dare to dream of better futures. I've heard from my former colleagues over email that the district no longer administers the DAPS. So here's a shout out to my former students and to other dissenters. With humor, you imagine, you created, you innovated, you frolicked, you thought critically, you asked why, you said no, and you drew old women bending over in girdles for the testing administrators to see. I don't know about them, but you made me laugh a lot and hard. And you had a hand in changing things for the better. Way to go.